まり出した白い闇切り裂く翼になれ
Here is our next kanji. It might look familiar as well, but not for the same reason that our first kanji looked familiar. That's because this kanji looks exactly like the katakana ni, and for all intents and purposes, they are the exact same character. The difference is their usage, as they're used very differently, and the context that they will be in will be very different. So how do you write this? The same way that you make ni, the katakana ni. You make one horizontal line on top and a noticeably larger horizontal line beneath it. So what does this kanji mean? This kanji connotes the concept of two. Two lines, as opposed to one, which was only one line. Yeah, pretty basic, pretty straightforward. It's probably not a coincidence that the katakana ni looks like the kanji for two, because when you say two in Japanese, when you're counting, it is ni. So that is its first reading. Other readings include zi, huta, hutatsu, and hutatabi. Alone, it is read as ni and means two. It's used for counting. And just like one with the ambiguous counter, it becomes hutatsu with two, meaning an ambiguous counter. Now, I kind of crash-coursed you in the counters last time, and it probably wasn't the best explanation because I wasn't going to focus on it. But now, since 2 is so easy, 2 is already done. That's all you need to know about 2 for right now. I thought I would make it a little less brief and a little more conclusive. When you are counting things, not just counting in Japanese, things fall into categories, very distinct categories, though they're pretty broad at the same time, that represent the number of that kind of thing. So, for example, mai. If you were counting thin, flat objects like paper, tickets, plates, even boards, even cloth will do, you would use the counter mai. What does that mean, I would use that counter? Well, first off, counters are represented by kanji, but since you don't know the kanji, you'll notice I'm writing it in hiragana. That's what you use them for. If you don't know the kanji, you use the hiragana. So, let's say that I want to count stamps. Now, stamps is kite in Japanese. So, how would I say 2 stamps? I can't just say ni kite. That's not good enough. I have to say 2 thin flat objects that are stamps. So how would I say that? Ni mai no kite is how I would say 2 stamps. Note that 2 is read as ni, which is how it's usually read, but it's followed by mai, which connotes the fact that you are counting flat, thin objects, which are stamps in this case. And you put 2 flat, thin objects in the possessive by putting no in between them and that which is counted, which is stamps. And for the record, nouns do not change when you go from plural to singular and from singular to plural. Kite is 1 stamp. Kite can also mean plural stamps. So, if I wanted to say 1 stamp or 2 stamps, the stamp part wouldn't change, but the number would. The counter wouldn't change either. So, if I didn't know, or if I wasn't sure that stamps were counted among the thin flat objects used with mai, I could say hutatsu no kite, and it means the same thing, but it just means that you didn't know that stamps fell under that counter jurisdiction, or that you didn't even know what counters were. You could use futatsu, and that's what we mean by ambiguous counter, that you can use it in place of all things. it would behoove you to get familiar with the counters. Don't get too familiar with them yet if it bothers you, but understand what they mean. That when we say a number of certain things, we have to add counters to be more specific. So what are some other counters? Well, how about bound objects? Satsu is the counter for bound objects. What do I mean by bound objects? I mean like books, newspapers, that sort of thing. Not newspapers, unless you have a bundle of newspapers. Magazines, that's more correct. If you're counting animals, provided that they're not birds, the counter is hiki. Why not birds? Because birds have their own counter, and I'm almost positive that bats are also concerned in this counter, because they literally meant small flying animals that weren't insects, and it's wa. So that's the counter for that. If I'm counting boxes or cases, I would use the counter honey. If I were counting buildings or houses, I would use the counter ken. If I was counting copies of something, I would use the counter bu. If I was counting cups or glassfuls, liquid or dry, it doesn't matter, it would be hai. If I was counting floors of a building, I would use the counter kai. If I was counting long cylindrical objects, such as bottles, chopsticks, even fingers and legs fall into this category, I would use hon. If I was counting slices of something, I would use kire. If I was counting machines or vehicles, I would use the counter dai. If I were counting people, I would use the counter nin. And if I was counting a bunch of small objects that did not qualify as thin flat objects, animals, birds, or bats, bound objects like books or magazines, boxes, cases, buildings, houses, copies, cupfuls of something, floors of a building, long cylindrical objects, slices, machines, or people, then I would use ko. And if I didn't know what the heck I was doing, I would use the ambiguous counter. I'll give you the ambiguous counter for each of the numbers. 1 was 1 line, 2 was 2 lines. Do you have any educated guess about what 3 might be? Well, we'll double check how good you are in the next episode. This is Angel of Crepusculence signing off.